I'm Tiana Richardson, 52 years old, and 3 years ago, I experienced something that opened my eyes to how deeply systemic racism can infiltrate even the most progressive-seeming workplaces. I thought I was being a team player, mentoring a new hire who would eventually become my peer. But what happened next taught me something even more important about how discrimination disguises itself as business decisions. If you've ever felt like you had to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this experience. 28 years ago, I walked into Morrison & Associates Marketing, fresh out of graduate school with my MBA, student loans weighing heavy on my shoulders, but optimism lighting up my chest. The downtown Seattle office building smelled like fresh coffee and possibility, all glass and steel, reaching toward clouds that reminded me of the endless potential I felt coursing through my veins. I chose Morrison specifically because their website proudly displayed diversity statistics, their leadership spoke at conferences about inclusive hiring, and during my interview, 3 different people mentioned their commitment to equity. Sarah Morrison herself, the company founder, had looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Tiana, we need fresh perspectives here. Your innovative thinking during the case study presentation is exactly what our clients need." The warm handshake, the genuine smile, the way she lingered to ask about my background in consumer psychology. It all felt like I'd finally found a place where being different would be an asset, not an obstacle. Those first 5 years were everything I'd dreamed they could be. I threw myself into every project with the kind of energy that comes from believing you're exactly where you belong. My cubicle gradually filled with commendation letters from clients, awards from industry conferences, and photos from company retreats, where I genuinely felt like part of the team. I remember the thrill of landing the Cascade Healthcare account during my second year, a $1 million contract that came about because I'd suggested focusing on community trust rather than just clinical outcomes. Jennifer Walsh, the senior account director, had pulled me aside afterward and said, "Tiana, that was brilliant. You see angles the rest of us miss." The validation felt warm and real, settling into my bones like sunshine after years of cloudy skies. By year 7, I'd been promoted to senior marketing strategist, with my own office overlooking Elliott Bay, and a salary that finally allowed me to buy my parents the anniversary trip to Italy they'd always talked about. The view from my window stretched across the water toward the Olympic Mountains, and every morning as I sipped my coffee and planned my day, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. My calendar stayed packed with client meetings where CEOs and department heads would specifically request my input on reaching diverse markets. I'd developed a reputation for cultural competency that felt genuine rather than performative, understanding how to speak to communities I'd grown up in, while translating that wisdom into strategies that generated real results. The highlight of each week was our Thursday strategy sessions, where the team would brainstorm around the conference table, ideas flowing like water, and I'd contribute insights that made everyone else nod and scribble notes. "Tiana's got that magic touch," David Chen, our creative director, would say, and the way he said it felt like respect, not exoticism. During what I now think of as my golden period, from year 8 through year 15, I genuinely believed I'd made it. My days started at 6 a.m. with emails from international clients who trusted my judgment on global campaigns, followed by strategic planning meetings where my voice carried equal weight with colleagues who'd become real friends. Lisa Martinez and I would grab lunch every Tuesday, sharing not just work frustrations but real pieces of our lives, her struggles with fertility treatments, my concerns about my aging mother, the kind of conversations that happen between people who truly see each other. Team happy hours weren't obligatory networking events, but actual celebrations where I'd find myself laughing until my stomach hurt, planning weekend hiking trips with colleagues who knew my coffee order and remembered my birthday. The work itself energized me daily. I developed a specialty in crisis communications for companies facing diversity-related challenges, and the success stories mounted like building blocks of a career I was genuinely proud of. When Sarah Morrison announced my promotion to Vice President of Strategic Communications during the company holiday party in 2018, the applause felt thunderous and real, and I remember thinking, This is what progress looks like. But looking back now, I can identify the subtle warning signs that my optimistic brain categorized as isolated incidents rather than patterns. There was the time Marcus Thompson, a white colleague hired 6 months after me, got assigned to present my campaign strategy to the board because, as Jennifer explained, he just has that executive presence. I'd felt a small twist in my stomach but convinced myself that presentation skills were different from strategy skills, and maybe Marcus really was better at that particular aspect. When the Riverside Community Center contract, an account I'd personally developed by building relationships in that predominantly black neighborhood, got reassigned to Katie Wilson because she had more bandwidth, I'd felt that same stomach twist but accepted the explanation that my existing client load was already heavy. The pattern of being excluded from informal decision-making conversations, discovering strategic shifts through email, rather than face-to-face discussion, having my ideas credited to the team, rather than attributed to me personally. All of these had felt like minor irritations, rather than red flags. The most telling sign, though I didn't recognize it then, was how often people would express surprise at my insights, as if my intelligence was unexpected, rather than the very reason I'd been hired. The morning everything changed started like any other Thursday in March 2022. I'd arrived at the office early, as was my habit, stopping by the break room to brew the Ethiopian coffee I kept in my desk drawer, a small luxury that marked the beginning of each productive day. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and waiting for water to heat had become meditative, a moment of calm before diving into campaign strategies and client calls. As I walked toward my office, ceramic mug warming my palms and the rich aroma creating a small cloud of comfort around me, I noticed Sarah Morrison standing outside my door with someone I didn't recognize. Even from a distance, I could see the deliberate way she was positioning herself, the practiced smile that meant important conversation ahead, and I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation that came with new opportunities. Growing up in Oakland as the daughter of two public school teachers, I'd learned early that success in predominantly white spaces required a specific kind of navigation. My parents, both educators who'd fought their own battles against institutional barriers, had taught me strategies that felt like survival skills disguised as life lessons. Be twice as good to get half as much, my father would say while reviewing my homework each night, his teacher's instincts sharp even at the kitchen table. But don't let that make you bitter, baby girl. Let it make you brilliant. My mother's approach was more tactical. Watch how they treat each other, then do that but better. Build relationships, but keep your own counsel, and always document everything. These lessons had shaped my professional approach, leading me to over-prepare for every meeting, volunteer for additional responsibilities, and maintain detailed records of all my contributions. I'd thought these strategies were working, that my success at Morrison proved their effectiveness. My investment in this company went beyond professional advancement, it had become part of my identity. Over 15 years, I'd poured not just my work hours, but my emotional energy into building something meaningful here. I'd stayed late to mentor younger employees, spent weekends crafting proposals that could have waited until Monday, and used my personal network to bring in clients who might not have otherwise considered Morrison. The Cascade Healthcare account, the Riverside Community Center project, the 3 major crisis communication campaigns that had saved client relationships worth millions. These weren't just line items on my resume but pieces of my professional soul. I'd recommended Morrison to talented colleagues looking for opportunities, posted enthusiastically about company culture on LinkedIn, and genuinely felt proud when people asked where I worked. The investment was intellectual too. I'd developed proprietary frameworks for cultural competency and marketing that had become standard practice across our client base, methodologies that bore my fingerprints in every application. When Sarah introduced me to Bradley Stevens that Thursday morning, my first impression was of someone who seemed pleasant enough but oddly familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. He was probably 32, with that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been the only one of anything in any room he'd entered. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his smile genuine but practiced, and his blue Oxford shirt was pressed exactly the way mine always were, professional without being stuffy. Tiana, I'm so excited to meet you, he said, and his enthusiasm seemed real. Sarah's told me incredible things about your work here. I'm really looking forward to learning from you. The phrase learning from you sent a warm flutter through my chest, the kind of recognition that never got old no matter how often it came. As Sarah explained that Bradley would be joining our team as a senior marketing associate, and that she'd like me to personally mentor him through his first few months, I felt genuinely excited about the opportunity. Mentoring had always energized me. There was something deeply satisfying about helping someone else navigate the complexities of our industry, sharing hard-won insights and watching someone grow into their potential. Bradley comes to us from Portland with some great ideas about digital engagement, Sarah continued, but we thought pairing him with our most experienced strategist would give him the foundation he needs to really excel here. The way she said most experienced strategist made me stand a little taller. This felt like recognition, like being chosen for something important because of my expertise and track record. Over the next 6 weeks, I threw myself into Bradley's development with the same thoroughness I brought to everything else. We started each morning with coffee in my office, where I'd walk him through the strategic thinking behind current campaigns, explaining not just what we were doing but why each decision had been made. I shared my frameworks for cultural competency, the relationship-building strategies that had helped me land major accounts, and the crisis communication protocols I'd developed through years of trial and refinement. Bradley was an engaged student, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes in a leather portfolio that reminded me of the one I'd carried during my early years at Morrison. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking I want to develop," he'd say after I'd explain a particularly complex campaign approach, and his eagerness felt validating in the way that comes from being truly seen for your expertise. I introduced Bradley to key clients personally, spending my political capital to ensure he'd be welcomed into conversations that had taken me years to earn access to. During the Riverside Community Center quarterly review, I made sure to highlight how Bradley's fresh perspective on social media engagement could complement the community-based strategies we'd already established. "Tiana's been such an incredible mentor," Bradley told the client, and the appreciation in his voice seemed genuine. "I feel like I'm getting a masterclass in strategic thinking." These moments felt like investments in both his future and the company's continued success, exactly the kind of leadership development that had been missing from my own early career. The first hint that something might be different came during a conversation with Lisa Martinez in early May. We were having our usual Tuesday lunch at the seafood place near Pike Place Market, sharing updates about weekend plans and work frustrations, when she mentioned something that made me pause mid-bite of my salmon salad. "It's interesting how much time Sarah's been spending with Bradley," Lisa said, her tone carefully neutral in the way that suggests someone's trying not to say too much. "I've noticed them having a lot of closed-door conversations lately. I'd seen the same thing but hadn't thought much of it. New employees often needed extra attention from leadership, and Bradley's enthusiasm probably made those conversations more frequent than usual." "He's eager to learn," I'd responded, and Sarah's always been good about supporting new talent. But Lisa's expression suggested she was thinking something different, something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud. 2 weeks later, during our monthly strategy meeting, I noticed a shift in dynamics that felt subtle but significant. When I presented my quarterly analysis of client satisfaction trends, the room's attention seemed divided in a way that hadn't happened before. Sarah was checking her phone periodically. David was taking notes but not asking his usual follow-up questions, and Jennifer seemed to be listening but not really engaging with the content. It was Bradley who asked the most substantive questions, demonstrating knowledge of accounts and strategies that impressed me but also felt slightly premature given his short time with the company. "That's a really insightful point about seasonal messaging," he said during my presentation about the Cascade Healthcare campaign. "But I wonder if we're missing opportunities for digital integration that could amplify those community connections." The question was good. Excellent, actually. But something about the timing and confidence behind it made my stomach do that familiar small twist. The pattern became more noticeable over the following month. Bradley was being included in conversations I'd expected to be part of, receiving strategic documents that used to come to me first, and developing relationships with senior leadership that seemed to accelerate beyond normal new employee integration. When I mentioned to Sarah that I'd be happy to include Bradley in the Morrison Industries contract negotiations, a major client relationship I'd built over 7 years, she'd smiled but said, "Actually, I think Bradley might take the lead on that one. Fresh eyes, you know. But of course we'll want you available for consultation." The word consultation landed like a small stone in my chest, heavy and cold in a way that made me question whether I was overreacting. The morning Sarah called me into her office for what she described as a strategic conversation, I felt the same mixture of anticipation and apprehension that had marked so many pivotal moments in my career. The June sunlight streaming through her corner windows created geometric patterns on the hardwood floor, and the familiar scent of her lavender diffuser usually made me feel welcomed and valued. But something in her posture, the way she was sitting slightly more formally than usual, the manila folder on her desk that hadn't been there during our casual interactions, suggested this conversation would be different from our typical check-ins. "Tiana, I want to start by saying how much we value your contributions to this company," Sarah began, and immediately I felt my nervous system activate in the way that happens when someone starts with reassurance before delivering difficult news. "Your expertise and dedication have been fundamental to our success, and we want to make sure you know that." The careful phrasing, the emphasis on past contributions rather than future opportunities, the way she wasn't quite making eye contact, all of it felt like preparation for something I wasn't going to want to hear. My hands found each other in my lap, fingers interlacing in the self-soothing gesture that had carried me through difficult conversations since childhood. "We've been thinking about organizational structure," Sarah continued, "and we believe there might be an opportunity for you to focus more specifically on the work you do best." The phrase "the work you do best" sent a chill through me because it sounded like limitation disguised as opportunity. Bradley has shown real promise in client relationship management and strategic oversight, and we think there might be a natural division of responsibilities that would let both of you excel in your respective strengths. As she spoke, I found myself analyzing not just her words but her tone, the careful way she was constructing each sentence, the obvious rehearsal behind what was supposed to sound like spontaneous strategic thinking. What she was describing, though she never used these words directly, was a fundamental restructuring of my role that would move me away from the client-facing strategic work I'd built my reputation on, and toward what sounded like internal consulting and project management. Bradley, meanwhile, would be taking over the Morrison Industries account, the Cascade Healthcare relationship, and the crisis communication portfolio I'd developed over more than a decade. "We see this as a promotion for both of you," Sarah explained, but when I asked for specifics about title changes, salary adjustments, and reporting structures, her answers became vague in a way that made my stomach drop toward my shoes. I left that meeting with my head spinning and my chest tight with the kind of anxiety that comes from recognizing a pattern you've been trying not to see. The walk back to my office felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the growing understanding that something fundamental had shifted without my knowledge or consent. Colleagues I passed offered their usual friendly greetings, but I found myself wondering if they already knew something I was just beginning to understand. The familiar environment that had felt like home for 15 years suddenly felt foreign, as if the lighting had changed or the walls had been painted a slightly different shade while I wasn't paying attention. That evening, I called my sister Monica, who worked in human resources for a tech company in Portland. As I described the conversation with Sarah, trying to keep my voice level and analytical, Monica's responses grew increasingly pointed. "Tiana, what you're describing sounds like they're easing you out of your own job," she said, with the kind of directness that only siblings can manage. "They brought in someone to learn everything you know, and now they're restructuring around him. This isn't about maximizing everyone's strengths. This is about replacement." The word replacement hit me like cold water, shocking in its clarity and impossible to unhear once it had been spoken. I spent the next several days observing workplace dynamics with new eyes, paying attention to patterns I'd previously dismissed as coincidental or temporary. Bradley's calendar had somehow filled with meetings I used to attend, his name was appearing on strategy documents that used to be my domain, and colleagues were beginning to direct questions to him that they'd previously brought to me. When I attempted to join a conversation about the Morrison Industries contract renewal, Jennifer had looked genuinely surprised and said, "Oh, I thought Bradley was handling that now." The casual way she said it, as if this transition was common knowledge, made me realize how completely I'd been excluded from decisions about my own professional responsibilities. The most telling moment came during a client call with Cascade Healthcare, an account I'd managed for over 7 years. As I joined the video conference, I noticed that Bradley was listed as the primary contact, and I was noted as additional support. Throughout the hour-long strategy session, the client directed most of their questions to Bradley, who handled them competently using frameworks and approaches I'd taught him during our mentoring sessions. When Dr. Patricia Williams, the marketing director I'd worked with since the account's inception, said, "Bradley, we're so grateful for your innovative thinking on this community engagement strategy," I felt a jolt of recognition and disbelief. The community engagement strategy was one I'd developed 2 years earlier, refined through multiple pilot programs, and presented to their board with measurable results. Watching Bradley receive credit for my intellectual property while I sat silently in the corner of the screen felt like watching someone else wear clothes I'd carefully tailored for myself. After the call ended, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to rationalize or make excuses for what was happening, I started documenting everything with the kind of systematic thoroughness my mother had taught me years earlier. I created a detailed timeline of my role changes, saved emails that demonstrated my ownership of various strategic approaches, and began keeping records of meetings where my contributions were being attributed to Bradley. The process of documentation forced me to confront the scope of what was happening. I wasn't just being marginalized or overlooked, I was being systematically replaced by someone I'd been asked to train. During my next mentoring session with Bradley, I decided to test my growing suspicions by asking direct questions about his understanding of our working relationship. "I'm curious about your perspective on how our roles might evolve over the next year," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of discomfort or evasion. His response was revealing in its confidence. "Well, I think I'm starting to get a real handle on the strategic side of things, and Sarah mentioned I might be taking on more client-facing responsibilities soon. I hope that doesn't step on your toes. I know you've built amazing relationships here." The casual way he mentioned conversations with Sarah that I'd never been part of, the assumption that his expanded role was natural and inevitable, the polite concern about stepping on my toes while describing exactly that, all of it confirmed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house in Tacoma, needing the kind of perspective that only comes from people who've known you longer than any job title or professional identity. As I sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework while they graded papers and planned lessons, I described what was happening at Morrison, with the kind of detail that made the pattern impossible to ignore. My father listened with the analytical attention he'd always brought to complex problems, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just absorbing the information. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking with the kind of measured conviction that had made him an effective educator for 35 years. "Baby girl, what you're describing isn't just workplace politics or organizational restructuring," he said, his teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen similar patterns countless times in different contexts. "This is what systemic racism looks like in corporate environments. They found someone who looks like what they think leadership should look like. They used your expertise to train him, and now they're positioning him to take over the work you built. The fact that they did it gradually, using language about optimization and playing to strengths, doesn't make it less discriminatory. It just makes it harder to challenge." My mother's response was even more direct. "Tiana, you've been hustling for 15 years trying to prove you belong in a place that was never planning to let you belong at the level you've earned. They kept you around because your work generates results, but they never intended for you to be the face of that success long term." Her words stung because they contained a truth I'd been working hard not to see. Despite all my achievements, despite the relationships I'd built, and the accounts I'd landed, despite 15 years of exceeding expectations and building the company's reputation in communities that had specifically trusted me, I was still seen as valuable but not leadership material, skilled but not executive potential. The conversation with my parents gave me the clarity I needed to make a difficult decision. I couldn't continue pretending that what was happening was anything other than what it clearly was, a systematic effort to replace me with someone who fit their vision of what success should look like, using my own expertise as the tool for my displacement. But I also couldn't simply accept the situation passively, hoping that things would somehow improve if I just continued working harder and proving my worth more conclusively. Monday morning, I requested a formal meeting with Sarah to discuss my role and future opportunities within the company. As I prepared for this conversation, I felt the same mixture of nervousness and determination that had carried me through every other pivotal moment in my career. The difference was that this time, I was going in with my eyes fully open about what I was dealing with, armed with documentation and clear about what I needed to hear in order to determine my next steps. The meeting took place in Sarah's office on a gray Tuesday morning in late June, with Seattle's characteristic drizzle creating a soft percussion against the windows that somehow made everything feel more serious and consequential. I'd prepared for this conversation the way I'd once prepared for major client presentations, with talking points, supporting documentation, and clear objectives. But as I sat across from Sarah's desk watching her arrange papers with the kind of deliberate casualness that suggests preparation for a difficult conversation, I realized that no amount of strategic planning could fully prepare me for what was about to unfold. "Sarah, I wanted to talk directly about the role restructuring you mentioned last month," I began, keeping my voice level and professional despite the way my heart was beating against my ribs. "I've been thinking about the implications of the changes you described, and I have some concerns about how they align with my career trajectory and the value I bring to this organization." I'd practiced these opening lines until they felt natural, but saying them out loud in her office made them feel both more real and more risky than they had in my head. Sarah's response confirmed my worst suspicions while somehow managing to sound reasonable and well-intentioned. "Tiana, I'm glad you brought this up because I think there might be some miscommunication about what we're envisioning," she said, her tone suggesting that any problems were simply matters of clarity rather than fundamental disagreements about my value or future. "We absolutely see you as a key part of this organization's future. The restructuring is really about playing to everyone's strengths and creating opportunities for growth that might not have existed in the previous structure." As she continued explaining the new opportunities available to me, I realized I was listening to a carefully constructed narrative designed to make discrimination sound like career development. My new role would focus on internal strategy consulting and organizational development, which sounded impressive until I asked for specifics about clients, budgets, and decision-making authority. The consulting would be primarily internal, the development would focus on processes rather than accounts, and the authority would be advisory rather than executive. Meanwhile, Bradley would be transitioning into client relationship management, strategic oversight, and external representation. Essentially everything that had made my job valuable and visible. "What about the Morrison Industries account?" I asked, referring to the relationship I'd built over 7 years and the contract worth over $2 million annually. "And the Cascade Healthcare Partnership?" These weren't just line items on a spreadsheet. They were relationships I'd cultivated through years of consistent performance and personal investment. Sarah's answer was devastating in its casual efficiency. "We think Bradley's fresh perspective might be exactly what those clients need to take their engagement to the next level. Of course, we'd want you available for consultation during the transition." The word consultation appeared again, and this time I understood it clearly as code for "we'll extract whatever knowledge you have and then minimize your ongoing involvement." I pressed for details about how my compensation would change, what my advancement opportunities would look like, and whether I'd have any path back to client-facing strategic work. Sarah's responses were vague in the way that suggests someone is avoiding making commitments they don't intend to keep. "We're still working out those details," became her standard response to any question about specifics, while she remained crystal clear about Bradley's expanding responsibilities and bright future with the company. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, and by the end I understood that I was being offered a choice between accepting marginalization or facing the more direct consequences of refusing to cooperate with my own displacement. Sarah never said these words explicitly, But the subtext was unmistakable. I could gracefully accept the new role and maintain some connection to the work I'd built, or I could resist and likely find myself facing performance improvement plans, cultural fit concerns, or other mechanisms companies use to manage out employees who won't comply with their restructuring. I left that meeting knowing I needed advice from someone with expertise in employment law and workplace discrimination. That afternoon I called Marcus Williams, an employment attorney my sister had recommended, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. During our 90-minute meeting in his downtown office, I laid out the timeline of events, shared the documentation I'd been keeping, and described the current situation with the kind of detail that made patterns impossible to ignore. Tiana, what you're describing is a textbook case of what we call structured replacement, Marcus explained, his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd seen this pattern many times before. Companies have learned they can't simply fire experienced employees of color without cause, but they can create situations where those employees are systematically marginalized until leaving becomes the most reasonable option. The fact that they had you train your replacement while describing it as mentoring makes this particularly egregious. Marcus walked me through the legal framework surrounding workplace discrimination, explaining how cases like mine could be pursued under Title VII and state anti-discrimination laws. He also outlined the challenges proving discriminatory intent is difficult when companies use language about optimization and restructuring, and the legal process can be lengthy and emotionally draining. Most importantly, he helped me understand that I had options beyond simply accepting the situation or engaging in a legal battle that might take years to resolve. You have leverage here that you might not recognize, he said, pulling out a legal pad and sketching out a strategy that focused on documentation, clear communication, and strategic pressure. Your track record speaks for itself, your client relationships are documented, and the pattern of replacement is obvious to anyone looking objectively. The question is whether you want to fight for your position here, or use this situation as a stepping stone to something better. That evening, I had a long conversation with my husband Jerome, who'd been watching me process this situation with the kind of patient support that comes from 23 years of marriage. As we sat on our back deck overlooking the garden we'd spent years cultivating, I described the legal consultation and the options I was facing. Jerome's response was characteristically direct. Tiana, you've spent 15 years building other people's dreams while sacrificing pieces of your own. Maybe this is the universe telling you it's time to build something that belongs entirely to you. His words hit me with the force of recognition because they connected to dreams I'd been pushing aside for years. During my early years at Morrison, I'd occasionally fantasized about starting my own consulting firm, focusing on the cultural competency and crisis communication work that energized me most. But success at Morrison had made those dreams feel unnecessary, and the security of a steady paycheck had made entrepreneurship feel risky. Now facing the reality that my success at Morrison had never translated into the kind of security I'd imagined, those dreams began to feel less like fantasy and more like destiny. Over the next 2 weeks, I began having quiet conversations with people in my professional network, ostensibly casual check-ins that allowed me to gauge interest in the kind of independent consulting work I was beginning to envision. The responses were more encouraging than I'd expected. Dr. Patricia Williams from Cascade Healthcare mentioned that she'd been frustrated with Morrison's recent changes in account management and would be interested in working directly with me if such an option became available. 3 other clients made similar comments, suggesting that my relationships and reputation were more portable than I'd realized. The turning point came during a team meeting in mid-July, where I watched Bradley present a crisis communication strategy to our entire department. As he spoke, I recognized every key element the 3-phase response framework I'd developed after the Pacific Northwest hospital chain scandal, the community engagement protocols I'd refined through multiple client implementations, and even specific language I'd crafted for sensitive situations. He presented these approaches confidently and competently, but when Jennifer Walsh asked about the theoretical foundation behind the strategy, Bradley's response revealed that he understood the what but not the why behind these methodologies. Sitting in that conference room, watching my intellectual property being presented as someone else's innovation while I was credited only as part of the collaborative team that helped develop these approaches, I felt something shift inside me from sadness to anger to clarity. This wasn't just about workplace politics or even discrimination anymore, it was about my professional dignity and my responsibility to the clients who trusted me. I'd spent 15 years building expertise that was now being used to justify my marginalization, and continuing to accept this situation felt like betraying not just myself but everyone who'd supported my career and relied on my competence. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight for my position at Morrison or accepting the diminished role they were offering, I would use their own actions as the foundation for building something better. If they wanted to replace me with someone who could mimic my approaches without understanding their foundations, I would take my expertise somewhere it would be valued appropriately. But first, I needed to have one more conversation that would clarify exactly where I stood and create a record of what had been offered. The second formal meeting with Sarah took place on a Friday afternoon in late July, with the kind of golden sunlight streaming through her office windows that made Seattle summers feel magical. I'd prepared for this conversation differently than our previous discussion, focusing less on understanding their perspective and more on creating clarity about my options. I knew that what happened in this room would determine whether I spent the next year fighting for recognition that might never come or channeling my energy toward building something that belonged entirely to me. Sarah, I've had time to think about the restructuring proposal, and I want to make sure I understand exactly what's being offered, I said, pulling out a notepad that signaled this was a formal conversation requiring documentation. Can you walk me through the specific responsibilities, compensation changes, and advancement opportunities in this new role? My tone was professional but direct, without the careful deference that had characterized so many of our previous interactions. Sarah's response revealed the true nature of what they were offering: a significant reduction in client contact, elimination of strategic oversight responsibilities, a lateral move in title with no salary increase, and vague promises about future opportunities that depended on organizational needs and budget availability. When I asked about timeline for potential advancement, she couldn't provide specific metrics or deadlines. When I inquired about my intellectual property and the methodologies I'd developed, she suggested that all such work belonged to the company and would continue to be used as needed across different accounts and team members. What about the Morrison Industries account specifically? I asked, referring to the relationship that represented nearly 30% of my current client portfolio, and the crisis communication retainer with Pacific Northwest Medical Group. These were accounts where my personal relationships and specialized expertise had been fundamental to both landing and maintaining the business. Sarah's answer was painfully clear. Bradley would be taking over both accounts with my involvement limited to transition support and occasional consultation as needed. The conversation lasted 30 minutes, and by the end, I had what I'd come for: complete clarity about their intentions and a documented record of what they were offering. As I walked back to my office, I felt the kind of calm determination that comes from finally understanding a situation completely and knowing exactly what needs to be done. They had shown me precisely how they valued my contributions, and now I could respond accordingly. That weekend, I spent hours in my home office outlining a business plan for Richardson Strategic Communications, the consulting firm I was now committed to launching. The work felt energizing in a way that nothing at Morrison had for months. Instead of fighting to maintain what I'd already built, I was designing something new that could grow without artificial limitations. Jerome found me Sunday evening surrounded by legal pads and laptop screens, mapping out service offerings and target markets with the kind of focused intensity that had characterized my best work at Morrison. "You look like yourself again," he said, bringing me coffee and settling into the chair across from my desk. "I haven't seen you this excited about work in months." His observation hit me with sudden recognition. I'd been so focused on fighting for my position at Morrison that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely enthusiastic about professional possibilities. The energy I was putting into planning my own firm reminded me why I'd fallen in love with strategic communication work in the first place, before office politics and workplace discrimination had drained so much joy from the process. Monday morning, I called Marcus Williams to discuss the legal implications of starting my own firm while still employed at Morrison. We spent an hour reviewing non-compete clauses, intellectual property considerations, and client relationship protocols. The good news was that my employment contract had relatively standard restrictions that wouldn't prevent me from starting a competing business after leaving Morrison. The better news was that several of my client relationships were based on personal trust and specialized expertise that couldn't be easily transferred to other account managers. Tiana, you're in a stronger position than you might realize, Marcus said, reviewing the documentation I'd gathered about my role changes and Bradley's expanding responsibilities. If Morrison wants to marginalize your contributions while using your expertise to train your replacement, they're essentially creating the business case for why clients should work with you directly. Your track record and client relationships are your assets, regardless of where you choose to deploy them. Over the next 2 weeks, I began having strategic conversations with key clients, carefully navigating the ethics of these discussions while gathering information about their satisfaction with current account management and their interest in alternative service providers. The pattern that emerged was both validating and encouraging. Clients consistently expressed concern about recent changes in their Morrison contacts, frustration with the learning curve new account managers required, and interest in working directly with consultants who understood their specific needs and challenges. Dr. Patricia Williams was particularly direct during a coffee meeting that officially focused on quarterly planning but covered much broader territory. Tiana, I've been working with you for 7 years, and frankly, you understand our community engagement challenges better than anyone else at Morrison, she said, stirring her latte with the kind of deliberate motion that suggests careful thought. If you ever decided to branch out on your own, Cascade Healthcare would be very interested in exploring a direct consulting relationship. Your cultural competency work has been transformative for our community outreach programs. Similar conversations with 3 other major clients revealed consistent themes. They valued my specific expertise, they were concerned about continuity under new account management, and they would consider alternative service arrangements if such options became available. These weren't commitments, but they were expressions of interest strong enough to support a business plan that could sustain me through the transition from employee to entrepreneur. The catalyst for my final decision came during a client presentation in mid-August, where I watched the last pieces of my professional identity being transferred to Bradley without acknowledgement or consultation. The Morrison Industries quarterly review had been scheduled as a joint presentation, with Bradley handling strategic overview and me covering implementation details. But when I arrived at the conference room, I discovered that the agenda had been changed without notification. Bradley would be presenting the complete strategic analysis, including frameworks and methodologies I'd developed, while I was listed as available for technical questions if needed. Sitting in the back of the room while Bradley presented my strategic frameworks to executives who'd worked with me for 7 years felt like watching someone else receive an award for work I'd done. When CEO Michael Morrison asked about the theoretical foundation behind our community engagement approach, Bradley gave a competent but surface-level response that demonstrated he'd memorized my methodology without understanding its deeper principles. The moment that crystallized everything was when Michael specifically asked, "Who developed this framework?" "It's exactly what we need for our expansion into underserved markets," and Bradley responded, "This represents the best thinking from our entire strategic team, but I've been leading the development of these approaches." I felt something inside me break and rebuild in that moment, like a bone healing stronger after being fractured. The betrayal wasn't just professional anymore, it was personal. I'd spent months training Bradley, sharing not just methodologies but the strategic thinking that made those approaches effective, and now I was watching him claim credit for intellectual property that represented years of my professional development. The injustice was stunning in its completeness, but it was also clarifying in a way that made my next steps obvious. After the meeting, I spent 20 minutes in my car in the parking garage, processing what I'd just experienced and calling my sister Monica to describe what had happened. Her response was immediate and direct. "Tiana, they're not just replacing you, they're erasing you. And if you let this continue, you're complicit in your own erasure." Her words hit me like cold water, shocking and necessary. I'd been so focused on fighting for recognition within a system that was designed to minimize my contributions, that I'd forgotten I had the option to leave that system entirely. That evening, I wrote my resignation letter, not the angry, emotional response I wanted to write, but a professional document that stated my decision clearly, while maintaining the dignity they'd been systematically undermining. The letter was brief and strategic. I was resigning to pursue independent consulting opportunities that would allow me to focus on the cultural competency and crisis communication work that had been most fulfilling during my tenure at Morrison. I expressed gratitude for the opportunities I'd been given and offered to help with transition planning to ensure clients would be well served during the changeover. The most satisfying part of writing that letter was the postscript I added. I want to acknowledge Bradley Stevens for his enthusiasm during our mentoring relationship. I'm confident that the frameworks and methodologies we discussed will serve him well as he develops his own approach to strategic communication. The language was gracious and professional, but anyone reading carefully would understand that I was claiming ownership of the intellectual property that had been attributed to others. I submitted my resignation on a Tuesday morning in late August, requesting a meeting with Sarah to discuss transition planning and departure logistics. Her reaction revealed everything I needed to know about how they'd been viewing my situation. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was leaving, as if marginalization and replacement were conditions I should have been grateful to accept indefinitely. "Tiana, I hope this isn't about the restructuring," she said, as if restructuring were a natural force rather than a series of deliberate decisions made by specific people. "We really do value your contributions here." The conversation that followed was surreal in its disconnect from reality. Sarah seemed to believe that offering me a diminished role while elevating my mentee should have felt like opportunity rather than insult. When I explained that I was leaving to start my own firm focusing on cultural competency and crisis communication, she expressed concern about client relationships and non-compete implications, as if my expertise and network belonged to Morrison rather than to me personally. The most revealing moment came when she asked whether there was anything they could do to convince me to stay, then immediately suggested that perhaps a small salary increase might address my concerns about the restructuring. "Sarah, this isn't about salary," I said, feeling calmer and more centered than I'd felt in months. "This is about professional respect and opportunity for growth. You've made it clear that my future here involves consulting on work that others will lead and receive credit for. I'm choosing to build something where my contributions will be valued appropriately." The directness felt liberating after months of careful navigation around the obvious realities of my situation. My last day at Morrison was September 15th, exactly 15 years and 6 months after I'd first walked into their downtown office, filled with optimism about professional possibilities. The symmetry felt appropriate. I was leaving with the same sense of possibility I'd arrived with, but this time I was creating opportunities rather than hoping someone else would provide them. The farewell gathering was professionally warm but emotionally hollow, with colleagues expressing regret about my departure while carefully avoiding any discussion of why I might be leaving. The most meaningful goodbye came from Lisa Martinez, who'd been watching the situation develop with the kind of clear-eyed understanding that comes from genuine friendship. As we shared coffee one last time at our usual Tuesday spot, she said something that made everything feel worth it. "Tiana, I've watched you handle this situation with incredible grace, but I'm glad you're finally putting yourself first. Morrison is losing their best strategic mind, and I think they know it even if they won't admit it." Richardson Strategic Communications officially launched on October 1, 2022 from the home office I'd spent weeks converting into a professional workspace that reflected both my aesthetic sensibilities and my practical needs. The first month was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, filled with business development calls, proposal writing and the thousand small details of building a company from scratch. But the work itself felt like coming home to myself after a long time away. My first major contract came from Cascade Healthcare, who hired me to develop a comprehensive cultural competency training program for their entire staff. Patricia Williams had been clear about their motivation. "Tiana, we need someone who understands both the clinical aspects of healthcare delivery and the cultural dynamics of community trust. Morrison has good people, but they don't have your specific expertise." The contract was worth $150,000 over 6 months, and it validated everything I'd believed about the value of specialization and authentic expertise. Within 3 months, I'd signed contracts with 4 other organizations, including 2 that had previously worked with Morrison, but were interested in more focused cultural competency consulting than their general marketing services could provide. The work was challenging and energizing in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen this field originally, before office politics and systemic barriers had complicated my relationship with professional success. The most satisfying validation came in February 2023, when Michael Morrison called me directly to inquire about consulting services for their expansion into Latino markets. "Tiana, we've been working with your former colleagues, but frankly, we need someone with deeper expertise in cultural dynamics," he said, apparently unaware of the irony in his request. Would Richardson Strategic be interested in a project focused on authentic community engagement? I politely declined, citing capacity constraints, but the call confirmed what I'd suspected: specialized expertise couldn't be easily transferred or replaced, regardless of how enthusiastic the replacement might be. By my 6-month anniversary as an entrepreneur, Richardson Strategic had generated more revenue than I'd ever earned as a Morrison employee, while working with clients who valued my expertise enough to pay premium rates for specialized knowledge. The financial success was gratifying, but the professional satisfaction was transformative. Every project reflected my strategic thinking, without requiring navigation around colleagues who might claim credit or supervisors who might minimize contributions. The work belonged to me in ways that employment had never allowed. The story took an interesting turn in April 2023, when I learned through industry contacts that Morrison was facing significant client retention challenges. The Morrison Industries account had reduced their retainer by 40% after expressing dissatisfaction with strategic guidance that felt generic rather than tailored to their specific market dynamics. Cascade Healthcare had ended their relationship entirely, citing concerns about cultural competency in their community outreach programs. 3 other major accounts had either reduced their commitments or moved to month-to-month arrangements while evaluating alternative service providers. I also learned that Bradley was struggling with the strategic depth required for crisis communication work, particularly in situations involving cultural sensitivity or community relations. An industry colleague mentioned that he'd been asking detailed questions about methodologies and frameworks during professional development sessions, suggesting he was still trying to understand the theoretical foundations behind approaches he'd been implementing. "He's competent," my colleague said, "but he doesn't have the instinctive understanding of cultural dynamics that made your work so effective. It's like he learned the steps without understanding the music." The most revealing information came from Lisa Martinez, who'd left Morrison 6 months after my departure to join a different firm. During a coffee meeting that felt like old times, she shared insights about the changes that had followed my resignation. "Tiana, losing you was more devastating than they'll admit," she said, stirring extra sugar into her latte with the kind of deliberate motion that accompanies difficult truths. "Bradley's good at executing strategies, but he doesn't have your ability to develop innovative approaches or navigate complex cultural situations. They're realizing that replacing your expertise isn't as simple as training someone enthusiastic." Lisa also mentioned that Sarah Morrison had been asking about the possibility of bringing me back as a consultant for specific projects, apparently recognizing that my specialized knowledge couldn't be easily replicated internally. The irony was rich. After systematically marginalizing my contributions and transferring my responsibilities to someone else, they now wanted to hire me at consulting rates to provide the expertise they'd previously taken for granted. I found their recognition validating, but had no interest in returning to an environment that had demonstrated such disregard for my professional value. The most satisfying development came in June 2023, when Pacific Northwest Medical Group, one of Morrison's major clients, reached out to Richardson Strategic directly. They'd been working with Bradley on a crisis communication plan following a discrimination lawsuit, but the initial strategy draft had been so tone-deaf that it would have made their public relations crisis significantly worse. "Tiana, we need someone who understands both legal implications and community dynamics," their CEO explained during our initial consultation. "The current approach feels like it was written by someone who's never actually dealt with discrimination issues." The project took 3 months and resulted in a crisis communication strategy that helped Pacific Northwest Medical Group rebuild trust with affected communities while addressing legal concerns effectively. The success generated referrals from their legal team, their board members, and community organizations that had been skeptical of their commitment to change. Within 6 months, Richardson Strategic had become the preferred consultant for healthcare organizations facing discrimination-related crises throughout the Pacific Northwest. By my first anniversary as an entrepreneur, I'd achieved something I'd never imagined possible during my years at Morrison: professional recognition based entirely on merit, client relationships built on mutual respect, and financial success that reflected the true value of specialized expertise. Richardson Strategic had grown from a one-person consultancy to a firm with 3 contractors and a waiting list of potential clients. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that reminded me daily why I'd chosen this profession. The success felt even more meaningful because it demonstrated that expertise, integrity, and authentic relationships could overcome the artificial barriers that had limited my opportunities at Morrison. Every client who chose Richardson Strategic over larger firms was essentially voting for competence over credentials, substance over superficial characteristics, and proven results over assumed potential. The marketplace had provided validation that institutional bias had withheld. In September 2023, exactly 1 year after leaving Morrison, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Morrison herself. She wanted to meet for coffee to discuss potential collaboration opportunities between our organizations. The conversation was fascinating in its careful avoidance of the circumstances surrounding my departure and its focus on current business needs that Richardson Strategic might help address. "Tiana, we've been hearing wonderful things about your work in the community," she said, as if my expertise was a recent development rather than something that had been undervalued while I was their employee. Sarah explained that Morrison was pursuing several large contracts that required cultural competency expertise they didn't currently have in-house. She wondered whether Richardson Strategic might be interested in serving as a specialized subcontractor for projects that required community engagement or crisis communication in diverse markets. The proposal was professionally attractive, significant revenue potential with established client relationships, but personally complicated given our history. I listened to her proposal with the kind of objective professionalism that came from financial security and emotional distance from the outcome. The irony was undeniable. Morrison now wanted to pay me as an external consultant to provide the same expertise they'd systematically marginalized when I was their employee. They were essentially acknowledging that my specialized knowledge was valuable enough to command premium consulting rates while never admitting that undervaluing that knowledge had been the reason for my departure. "Sarah, I appreciate you thinking of Richardson Strategic for these opportunities," I said, choosing my words carefully to maintain professionalism while establishing appropriate boundaries. "I'm certainly interested in projects that align with our expertise and capacity. However, I want to be clear that our consulting relationship would need to be structured as a true partnership with appropriate recognition for our contributions and decision-making authority over areas within our expertise." The message was diplomatic but firm. I would work with them on equal terms or not at all. The partnership that emerged over the following months was limited but mutually beneficial. Richardson Strategic provided cultural competency consulting for 3 major Morrison projects, generating significant revenue while establishing our reputation with new clients who became direct customers for future work. The arrangement allowed me to maintain professional relationships without compromising the independence I'd worked to establish. The most satisfying aspect of this collaboration was watching how differently I was treated as an external consultant compared to my previous experience as an employee. Recommendations I made were implemented without question. Strategic frameworks I developed were attributed to Richardson Strategic in all client communications. And my expertise was presented as a specialized asset that enhanced Morrison's service offerings. The contrast was stunning and confirmed everything I'd understood about how institutional bias affects internal versus external relationships. Working with Morrison as a consultant also gave me insight into how Bradley's role had evolved during my absence. He'd developed competence in account management and client relations, but the strategic innovation that had characterized my work was clearly missing from their service offerings. Several Morrison employees mentioned during project meetings that clients frequently asked for the kind of cultural insight and strategic creativity that had been fundamental to my previous work but wasn't consistently available in their current team structure. The collaboration reached its peak during a crisis communication project for Morrison Industries, the account I'd managed for 7 years before leaving. When a discrimination lawsuit threatened their expansion into Latino markets, they needed strategic guidance that could address both legal vulnerabilities and community relations challenges. Morrison's initial response had been legally sound but culturally tone-deaf, potentially making their reputation problems worse rather than better. Richardson's strategic strategy focused on authentic accountability combined with concrete action steps that demonstrated genuine commitment to change rather than damage control. The approach required deep understanding of community dynamics, legal implications, and stakeholder management, exactly the kind of multifaceted thinking that had made my work distinctive during my Morrison years. The project was successful enough that Morrison Industries increased their overall retainer while specifically requesting Richardson Strategic's involvement in all future diversity-related initiatives. By early 2024, Richardson Strategic had grown into something I'd never imagined during my years as an employee, a recognized leader in cultural competency consulting with a national reputation and client base spanning healthcare, technology, manufacturing, and nonprofit sectors. The success was deeply satisfying, but it was also educational in ways that clarified everything I'd experienced during my final years at Morrison. The entrepreneurial journey had taught me that my expertise was more valuable and more transferable than I'd understood while fighting for recognition within institutional structures. The clients who hired Richardson Strategic weren't doing me favors or making diversity-related gestures, they were paying premium rates for specialized knowledge that generated measurable results. The marketplace had provided validation that workplace politics had obscured, confirming that competence and integrity could overcome systemic barriers when deployed strategically. More importantly, building my own firm had demonstrated that professional satisfaction and financial success were possible without accepting marginalization or minimizing my contributions to make others comfortable. The energy I'd spent fighting for recognition at Morrison was now channeled toward building something that belonged entirely to me, generating better outcomes for everyone involved. Clients received more focused expertise. I received appropriate compensation and recognition, and the work itself reflected my values and capabilities without institutional constraints. The transformation was personal as well as professional. During my years at Morrison, I'd gradually internalized doubts about my capabilities and contributions, wondering whether my concerns about discrimination were accurate or whether I was simply not adapting well to changing organizational dynamics. The success of Richardson Strategic had eliminated those doubts completely, providing objective evidence that my expertise was valuable and my strategic thinking was sound. The confidence that came from entrepreneurial success also changed how I navigated other aspects of life. I found myself speaking up more directly in professional settings, advocating more effectively for other people facing similar challenges, and investing time in mentoring young professionals of color who were dealing with workplace dynamics I recognized from my own experience. The clarity that came from understanding my worth in market terms made it easier to recognize and respond to bias wherever it appeared. Looking back on the 3 years since leaving Morrison, I can see how each challenge had contributed to better outcomes than I'd originally imagined. The systematic replacement that had felt so devastating at the time had forced me to recognize possibilities I'd been too comfortable to explore. The marginalization that had been so painful had eliminated my attachment to institutions that didn't value my contributions appropriately. The discrimination that had felt so personal had motivated me to build something that could benefit others facing similar challenges. The most profound realization was that my years at Morrison hadn't been wasted, even though they'd ended in disappointment and frustration. Every client relationship I'd built, every strategic framework I'd developed, every crisis I'd navigated successfully had been preparation for something bigger than I'd imagined. The expertise that had been undervalued in that environment became the foundation for work that was valued appropriately in the broader marketplace. Richardson's strategic success had also generated opportunities to influence systemic change in ways that went beyond individual client work. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about cultural competency in business, to consult with organizations developing diversity initiatives, and to mentor entrepreneurs who were building companies focused on social impact. The platform that came with business success allowed me to advocate for changes that could benefit people facing challenges similar to those I'd experienced. The speaking engagements were particularly meaningful because they allowed me to share insights about navigating workplace discrimination while focusing on positive solutions rather than just identifying problems. During a keynote presentation at the Pacific Northwest Business Leadership Conference in March 2024, I described my journey from Morrison employee to successful entrepreneur without naming companies or individuals, focusing instead on universal patterns and actionable strategies. The most important lesson I learned, I told an audience of over 300 business leaders, is that expertise and integrity are always valuable even when they're not valued in particular environments. The goal isn't to spend our careers fighting for recognition from people who don't understand our worth. The goal is to find or create environments where our contributions can generate the impact and compensation they deserve. The standing ovation that followed felt like validation not just for my journey but for everyone who'd ever felt undervalued in professional settings. The mentoring work became equally important as the consulting business. Through informal networks and formal programs, I began working with young professionals of color who were navigating challenges similar to those I'd faced during my corporate years. The conversations were often painful in their familiarity, talented people wondering whether their perceptions of bias were accurate, accomplished professionals doubting their capabilities because of institutional gaslighting, strategic thinkers considering whether they belonged in environments that consistently overlooked their contributions. The most dangerous thing about workplace discrimination, I would tell mentees during our sessions, is how it makes you question your own judgment and capabilities. When systems are designed to minimize your contributions, it's easy to internalize those messages and wonder whether the problem is your performance rather than their perception. But the marketplace doesn't lie. If your expertise generates results, those results have value regardless of whether particular institutions recognize that value. The mentoring relationships also taught me about the broader impact of individual success stories. Several of the young professionals I worked with went on to start their own companies, join organizations that valued their contributions appropriately, or develop the confidence to advocate more effectively within existing structures. Watching their growth reminded me that personal success could generate collective progress when shared strategically. By the summer of 2024, Richardson Strategic had achieved something I'd never imagined during my years as an employee. We were consistently invited to compete for contracts that Morrison was also pursuing, and we were winning approximately 60% of those competitive situations. The success wasn't based on lower prices or personal relationships. It was based on demonstrated expertise in areas where cultural competency was essential for effective results. The most satisfying competitive victory came when Pacific Northwest Medical Group chose Richardson Strategic over Morrison for a comprehensive cultural transformation project worth over $400,000. The decision was based on our proven track record in healthcare crisis communication, our specialized knowledge of community engagement in diverse markets, and our ability to provide strategic leadership rather than just tactical implementation. When the contract was announced, I felt the kind of professional validation that comes from being chosen for capabilities rather than potential. Learning about Morrison's ongoing challenges through industry networks provided perspective on how my departure had affected their organizational capacity. Several major clients had reduced their relationships with Morrison specifically because of concerns about cultural competency in their strategic guidance. 2 competitors had recruited former Morrison employees who'd left citing concerns about organizational culture and advancement opportunities. The firm that had once seemed so stable and successful was struggling with client retention and talent management in ways that suggested systemic problems beyond any individual personnel decisions. The most revealing insight came during a conversation with a Morrison contractor who'd been hired to provide diversity training for their staff. "Tiana, they're trying to address issues they should have recognized years ago," she said during a networking event we both attended. The training is focused on unconscious bias and inclusive leadership, which suggests they're finally acknowledging that previous approaches weren't working. But you can't train your way out of systemic problems without addressing the policies and practices that created those problems in the first place. Her observation highlighted something I'd come to understand through my consulting work. Organizations often seek training solutions for discrimination problems that actually require structural changes. Unconscious bias workshops might help individuals recognize their assumptions, but they can't address systems that consistently undervalue certain employees or processes that enable discrimination to flourish unchallenged. Richardson Strategic's approach to organizational consulting focused on identifying and changing the specific policies, practices, and procedures that generated discriminatory outcomes, regardless of individual intentions or awareness. The work was more complex and time-intensive than traditional diversity training, but it generated sustainable changes rather than temporary awareness shifts. The systemic approach had proven particularly effective in healthcare settings, where unconscious bias could literally affect patient outcomes and community trust. Our work with Pacific Northwest Medical Group had resulted in measurable improvements in patient satisfaction among communities of color, increased staff retention among diverse employees, and enhanced community partnerships that strengthened their market position. The success generated referrals throughout the healthcare industry and established Richardson Strategic as a leader in healthcare equity consulting. Similar success in other industries had created opportunities to work with technology companies, financial services firms, and manufacturing organizations facing workforce diversity challenges or community relations crises. Each project reinforced my understanding that cultural competency wasn't just a moral imperative but a business necessity in increasingly diverse markets. Organizations that could navigate cultural dynamics effectively had competitive advantages that went far beyond compliance with diversity requirements. The business success had also generated personal opportunities I'd never anticipated during my employee years. In September 2024, I was invited to join the board of directors for Seattle Community Foundation, bringing Richardson Strategic's expertise to philanthropic initiatives focused on equity and inclusion. The position provided opportunities to influence resource allocation decisions while expanding my network among civic and business leaders who shared commitments to systemic change. Board service also introduced me to other entrepreneurs who'd built successful companies after leaving corporate environments where their contributions had been undervalued. The conversations were illuminating in their consistency. Talented professionals from diverse backgrounds were creating innovative businesses because traditional institutions hadn't provided appropriate opportunities for their capabilities. The collective success of these entrepreneurs was generating economic impact that benefited entire communities while demonstrating the costs of organizational bias to institutions that hadn't recognized their talent appropriately. The most profound personal transformation was the elimination of doubt about my professional judgment and capabilities. During my final years at Morrison, I'd gradually begun questioning whether my perceptions of discrimination were accurate, whether my strategic thinking was as sound as I'd believed, and whether I might be contributing to workplace dynamics that felt problematic. The success of Richardson Strategic had eliminated all such doubts by providing objective evidence that my expertise generated valuable results when deployed in environments that recognized its worth. The confidence that came from entrepreneurial success affected every aspect of my professional life. Client meetings felt like collaborative discussions between equals rather than situations where I needed to prove my competence. Strategic recommendations were presented with authority based on demonstrated expertise rather than careful deference to institutional hierarchies. Networking events became opportunities to share insights and build relationships rather than auditions for acceptance and recognition. Perhaps most importantly, the financial independence that came with business ownership eliminated the fear that had made me accept marginalization for longer than I should have. When your economic security depends on institutional approval, it's natural to avoid conflicts that might jeopardize your position. When your security comes from your own capabilities and client relationships, you can advocate for appropriate treatment without worrying about retaliation or career consequences. This transformation was evident during a consulting project with a technology company, where I witnessed a senior manager consistently interrupting and minimizing the contributions of women and employees of color during strategy meetings. In previous years, I might have addressed this pattern carefully and privately, hoping to change behavior without creating conflict. Instead, I spoke directly during the meeting. "Michael, I've noticed that several team members haven't been able to finish their thoughts before being interrupted. Could we establish a protocol that ensures everyone's input is heard completely?" The intervention was professional but firm, and it changed the meeting dynamics immediately. The broader impact of my journey became clear during a panel discussion at the Seattle Chamber of Commerce in November 2024, where I was invited to discuss entrepreneurship and economic development in diverse communities. As I described Richardson's strategic's growth and client impact, several audience members mentioned that my story had inspired them to pursue their own business ventures or advocate more effectively within existing organizations. "Tiana, what you've demonstrated is that expertise and integrity can overcome systemic barriers when deployed strategically," said Dr. Margaret Chen, a physician who'd recently launched her own healthcare consulting firm. "Your success provides a roadmap for other professionals who might be wondering whether leaving stable employment is worth the risk of entrepreneurship." Her comment highlighted something I'd begun to understand: individual success stories could generate collective progress by demonstrating possibilities that might otherwise seem too risky or uncertain. The panel discussion also provided opportunities to address questions I'd been hearing frequently during speaking engagements and mentoring sessions. Young professionals wanted to know how to recognize when workplace challenges were discrimination rather than normal career development difficulties. Experienced professionals were curious about strategies for building client relationships while still employed elsewhere. Entrepreneurs needed advice about maintaining confidence during the inevitable challenges of building new businesses. My responses emphasized patterns rather than specific situations, focusing on actionable insights that could apply to various circumstances. "The key indicator," I explained, "is whether your treatment aligns with your performance and contributions. If you're consistently exceeding expectations but not receiving recognition, advancement, or opportunities equivalent to colleagues with similar track records, that's worth examining more closely. If your expertise is valued when it's convenient but overlooked when it comes to leadership opportunities, that's a pattern worth documenting and addressing." The documentation advice generated particular interest from audience members who recognized similar patterns in their own experiences. "Write everything down," I emphasized. "Not because you're planning to file complaints, but because patterns become obvious when you see them on paper. And if you do decide to make changes, having records helps you make strategic decisions based on facts rather than emotions." The most meaningful part of these speaking opportunities was connecting with people who'd made their own difficult decisions about whether to stay in challenging environments or pursue alternatives. A software engineer mentioned that watching Richardson's strategic success had given her confidence to negotiate more effectively for promotions within her current company. A marketing manager said that my story had inspired him to start freelance consulting that eventually became a full-time business. A nonprofit leader described how learning about systemic patterns had helped her advocate for policy changes within her organization. These conversations reminded me that individual stories could generate collective progress when shared strategically. Every person who found the confidence to advocate for appropriate treatment, pursue entrepreneurial opportunities, or recognize their own worth was contributing to broader changes in workplace culture and business practices. The impact rippled outward in ways that went far beyond any single success story. As I approached the 2-year anniversary of Richardson's Strategic in October 2024, I reflected on how dramatically my professional life had changed since those final months at Morrison. The work I was doing felt more meaningful and impactful than anything I'd accomplished as an employee. The client relationships were built on mutual respect and shared objectives rather than hierarchical dynamics and institutional politics. The financial rewards reflected the true value of specialized expertise rather than arbitrary organizational compensation structures. Most importantly, The daily experience of work had transformed from something I endured to something I genuinely enjoyed. Monday mornings brought excitement about new challenges and opportunities rather than anxiety about workplace dynamics and political navigation. Client meetings were collaborative problem-solving sessions rather than performances designed to prove my competence. Strategic planning involved designing solutions I believed in rather than compromising my recommendations to accommodate institutional limitations. The transformation was so complete that it was sometimes difficult to remember how constrained and frustrated I'd felt during my final years at Morrison. The professional confidence that came from entrepreneurial success made those experiences feel like they'd happened to someone else, or like scenes from a movie about workplace dynamics rather than memories from my own career. The clarity that came from financial independence and client validation had eliminated the self-doubt that institutional bias had gradually created. This perspective shift was particularly evident during interactions with former Morrison colleagues who'd remained with the company. During occasional networking events where we encountered each other, their questions about my business success often revealed ongoing frustrations with institutional limitations I no longer had to navigate. Several mentioned feeling stuck in roles that didn't fully utilize their capabilities or frustrated with advancement opportunities that seemed limited by factors beyond their performance. "Tiana, you made it look easy," said David Chen during a chance encounter at a coffee shop near his office. "But leaving a stable job to start your own company must have been terrifying." His comment reflected assumptions I'd heard from other people about entrepreneurial risk and corporate security. The reality was almost exactly opposite. Staying at Morrison while my contributions were systematically marginalized had felt much more risky than building a business based on proven expertise and established client relationships. "David, the scariest part wasn't leaving Morrison," I replied. "The scariest part was realizing how much I'd been compromising my professional potential by staying in an environment that wasn't designed to value my contributions appropriately." Starting Richardson Strategic felt like finally betting on myself rather than hoping other people would recognize my worth. The conversation was friendly and professional, but it highlighted how differently we'd responded to similar organizational challenges. These interactions with former colleagues also provided insights into how Morrison had changed since my departure. Several people mentioned new diversity initiatives, unconscious bias training programs, and policy changes designed to address workplace equity concerns. The efforts sounded well-intentioned but also reactive, suggesting they were responding to problems that had become visible rather than proactively creating inclusive environments. They brought in a consulting firm to assess organizational culture. Lisa Martinez mentioned during one of our periodic coffee meetings. "The recommendations were pretty much everything you were trying to tell them years ago. But now they're paying external consultants to say it." Her observation highlighted a pattern I'd noticed in organizational change efforts. Institutions often needed to hear insights from outside experts, even when internal employees had been providing similar guidance for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that organizations frequently paid premium rates for external consulting on issues that experienced employees had been trying to address internally without recognition or support. Richardson Strategic had benefited from this dynamic, providing cultural competency guidance to companies whose own diverse employees had been advocating for similar changes without institutional response. This pattern reinforced my understanding that systemic change often required external pressure rather than internal advocacy alone. Employee concerns could be dismissed as personal opinions or agenda-driven complaints, but consultant recommendations carried authority that internal voices might not achieve. The marketplace provided validation that institutional hierarchies could obscure, confirming that expertise was valuable regardless of its source. Richardson's strategic success had also generated opportunities to influence these dynamics more broadly through partnership with other firms focused on organizational change. During 2024, we'd collaborated with leadership development consultants, change management specialists, and legal experts to provide comprehensive approaches to workplace equity challenges. The partnerships allowed us to address systemic issues more effectively while building a network of professionals committed to similar objectives. The collaborative approach had proven particularly effective with large organizations where cultural transformation required multiple expertise areas and sustained engagement over months or years. Richardson's strategic's role typically focused on cultural competency assessment and strategy development, while partner firms provided implementation support, leadership coaching, and legal compliance guidance. The model generated better outcomes for clients, while allowing each firm to focus on their specific areas of excellence. One particularly successful collaboration involved working with a regional hospital system to address discrimination complaints that had generated legal exposure and community relations challenges. Richardson Strategic conducted cultural competency assessments across 5 facilities, identifying specific policies and practices that created barriers for employees and patients from diverse communities. Partner firms provided legal analysis, leadership development programs, and change management support that helped implement our recommendations effectively. The project took 18 months and resulted in measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, patient outcomes, and community trust. More importantly, it demonstrated that systematic approaches to workplace equity could generate business results that justified the investment beyond compliance requirements. The success generated referrals throughout the healthcare industry and established our collaborative model as a preferred approach for complex organizational change initiatives. As Richardson Strategic entered its 3rd year, I began thinking about long-term impact beyond individual client work. The business had achieved financial success and professional recognition, but I was increasingly interested in creating systemic changes that could benefit future generations of professionals facing challenges similar to those I'd experienced. The question was, how to leverage current success into broader influence on workplace culture and business practices. The answer emerged through conversations with other successful entrepreneurs who'd built companies focused on social impact alongside business success. Several had established foundations, created scholarship programs, or developed mentoring initiatives that extended their influence beyond direct client work. Others had used their financial success to invest in early-stage companies founded by entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities, creating multiplier effects that generated broader economic impact. After months of strategic planning and legal consultation, I announced the Richardson Foundation in February 2025, focused on supporting entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities who were building businesses that addressed systemic challenges in their industries. The foundation would provide seed funding, mentoring support, and access to professional networks that could help promising ventures achieve sustainable success. The foundation's first cohort included 8 companies: a healthcare technology firm developing culturally responsive patient communication tools, a financial services company creating investment products for underserved communities, a marketing agency specializing in authentic multicultural campaigns, and 5 other ventures that combined business innovation with social impact objectives. Each company received $50,000 in funding along with 6 months of intensive mentoring and network development support. Tiana, what you're creating here could change the entire landscape of business development in diverse communities, said Dr. Angela Washington, a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, who served on the foundation's advisory board. By supporting ventures that address systemic challenges while building sustainable businesses, you're demonstrating that social impact and financial success aren't mutually exclusive. The foundation work felt like a natural extension of everything I'd learned during my journey from corporate employee to successful entrepreneur. The challenges I'd faced at Morrison weren't unique to my situation or individual to that organization. They reflected systemic patterns that affected talented professionals across industries and geographic regions. Supporting other entrepreneurs who were building solutions to similar challenges felt like the most meaningful way to leverage my success for broader impact. The mentoring component of the foundation program also provided opportunities to share insights I'd gained through my own entrepreneurial journey. During monthly group sessions with foundation fellows, we discussed everything from strategic planning and client development to managing the emotional challenges of building companies while facing systemic barriers. The conversations were often intense and deeply personal, reflecting the vulnerability that comes with pursuing ambitious goals in environments that might not be designed to support your success. The most important thing to remember, I told one group of fellows during a session focused on overcoming self-doubt, is that your expertise and capabilities are valid regardless of whether particular institutions recognize them. The marketplace provides objective validation that institutional bias can obscure. If your solutions generate results for clients, those results have value no matter what assumptions people might make about your potential. These discussions also reinforced my understanding of how individual success stories could generate collective progress when shared strategically. Each fellow's journey provided insights that could benefit others facing similar challenges, creating a network of mutual support that extended far beyond formal mentoring relationships. The foundation was becoming a community of entrepreneurs committed to both business success and social impact, generating outcomes that were greater than any individual effort. As I sat in my office in early 2025, looking out at Elliott Bay and reflecting on the 3 years since leaving Morrison, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The discrimination and marginalization that had felt so devastating at the time had forced me to recognize possibilities I'd been too comfortable to explore. The systematic replacement that had threatened my career had motivated me to build something better than I'd originally imagined. Richardson Strategic had achieved success beyond my initial projections, generating financial independence while creating meaningful impact for clients and communities. The foundation was providing support for the next generation of entrepreneurs committed to combining business innovation with social progress. The speaking engagements and mentoring work were contributing to broader conversations about workplace equity and systemic change. Most importantly, the daily experience of work had become a source of energy and fulfillment rather than stress and frustration. Every client relationship reflected mutual respect and shared objectives. Every project utilized my expertise fully, while contributing to positive changes in organizational culture and business practices. Every strategic decision was mine to make based on my values and professional judgment rather than institutional constraints. The transformation was so complete that it was sometimes difficult to remember how constrained I'd felt during my final years at Morrison. The professional confidence that came from entrepreneurial success made those experiences feel like lessons from someone else's story rather than memories from my own career. The clarity that came from building my own company had eliminated the self-doubt that institutional discrimination had gradually created. But I also recognized that my journey had been possible because of specific advantages and opportunities that aren't available to everyone facing similar challenges. The financial cushion that allowed me to leave Morrison without immediate income replacement, the professional network that facilitated client development, the specialized expertise that translated easily to independent consulting, all of these factors had contributed to Richardson's strategic success in ways that might not apply to other situations. This recognition shaped my approach to mentoring and foundation work, emphasizing that there are multiple pathways to professional fulfillment and systemic change. Not everyone needs to become an entrepreneur, and not every workplace challenge requires leaving for alternative opportunities. Some of the most meaningful progress happens when talented professionals stay within institutions and advocate for changes that benefit future generations of employees. The key insight that applied across all situations was the importance of recognizing your own worth and advocating for appropriate treatment based on demonstrated capabilities rather than other people's assumptions or limitations. Whether that advocacy happens within existing organizations or through building alternative opportunities, the principle remains the same: expertise and integrity deserve recognition and compensation that reflect their true value. As I prepared for a keynote presentation at the National Conference on Workplace Equity in March 2025, I reflected on the messages that had emerged through my journey and how they might be most helpful for others facing similar challenges. The presentation would focus on 3 key themes: recognizing systemic patterns, building strategic responses, and creating opportunities for collective progress. Recognizing systemic patterns meant understanding that individual experiences of discrimination often reflect broader organizational dynamics rather than personal failures or misunderstandings. Documentation and analysis could reveal whether workplace challenges represented isolated incidents or systematic undervaluing that required strategic responses. The goal wasn't to assume discrimination in every difficult situation, but to gather enough information to make informed decisions about next steps. Building strategic responses involved developing options that ranged from internal advocacy to external alternatives, depending on organizational receptivity and individual circumstances. The most effective approaches often combined multiple strategies: documenting concerns, building alliances, seeking external guidance, and developing alternative opportunities that provided leverage for negotiation or transition planning. Creating opportunities for collective progress meant sharing insights and supporting others facing similar challenges, recognizing that individual success stories could generate broader changes when deployed strategically. Mentoring, speaking, writing, and community building all contributed to cultural shifts that could benefit future generations of professionals from underrepresented communities. The presentation would conclude with a call to action that emphasized personal agency alongside systemic awareness. You deserve to work in environments that value your contributions appropriately and provide opportunities that reflect your capabilities. If current environments don't provide those conditions, you have the power to advocate for changes or create alternatives. Your expertise and integrity are assets that belong to you, regardless of whether particular institutions recognize their worth. The message felt both personal and universal, reflecting lessons I'd learned through my own journey, while acknowledging that each person's path would be unique based on their circumstances, objectives, and opportunities. The goal wasn't to prescribe specific responses, but to provide frameworks for strategic thinking that could generate better outcomes regardless of the particular challenges people were facing. As the sun set over Elliott Bay and I finished preparing for another day of work that felt like calling rather than obligation, I thought about all the people who might benefit from understanding that professional fulfillment and appropriate recognition were possibilities worth pursuing, even when the path wasn't immediately obvious. My journey from Morrison employee to Richardson strategic founder had taught me that expertise and integrity could overcome systemic barriers when deployed strategically and supported by community. The most important lesson wasn't that everyone should become an entrepreneur, or that leaving challenging environments was always the right response. The most important lesson was that recognizing your worth and advocating for appropriate treatment were skills that could be developed and deployed in any environment, generating better outcomes for individuals and communities alike. If you've ever felt like you were working twice as hard for half the recognition, if you've ever wondered whether your perceptions of bias were accurate, if you've ever questioned whether you belonged in spaces where your contributions weren't valued appropriately, please know that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Your expertise belongs to you, your integrity belongs to you, and your potential belongs to you. The question isn't whether you're good enough for the opportunities you want. The question is whether those opportunities are good enough for what you have to offer, and if they're not, you have the power to find or create better alternatives. Document everything, build your network, develop your expertise, trust your judgment, and remember that sometimes the best thing that can happen to your career is being forced to build something that belongs entirely to you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonates with your experience, please share it with others who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in these challenges. Subscribe to join our community of professionals committed to creating workplaces where everyone's contributions are valued appropriately. And remember, your worth isn't negotiable, even when other people try to make it conditional. You deserve better, and you have the power to create it.